Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Clare Crew.
You're listening to the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Clare Crew, and in this episode, I'm speaking with Michelle Derrig about child protection. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
Yeah, it's a much needed conversation.
It is.
So you are a child protection advocate, and you're also the author of Only for Me, a picture book that empowers children to be the boss of their own body. Why did you write the book? What was the catalyst for doing this?
Sure. So it's been a real journey for me, Claire. So it was about, in actual fact, it was about exactly 4 years ago that I went out to dinner with some friends, and it was just supposed to be a typical night out with mums. And on that night, I heard about two separate incidences which involved young children being abused by their own peers. So in the first case, it was a 7-year-old, and he was on the way home from a play date at the park, and he actually disclosed to his mum that the other little 7-year-old had been inappropriately touching him while they were playing on the play equipment. And what's really significant about this case is that the mother of the little boy who'd been doing the abusing had disclosed to the other mum a few months prior that they'd discovered their 7-year-old accessing pornography on his iPad. And, during a very short period of time, sadly, this little boy actually developed an addiction to the pornography. And so the parents, of course, put measures in place to stop that. But what they weren't aware of is the fact that he was acting out because of what he'd been accessing.
Wow.
So it's pretty full on. And then in the second case, again, it was, a play date at the park. The mums were walking home from school, and it was actually their usual walk back home. And in this case, the mums actually had a few kids each. So when the 9-year-old boy said, to his mum he needed to go to the toilets, they suggested that the two 9-year-olds go together. Safety in numbers. They thought they were doing the right thing. And, they took a little bit longer than they should, and the gut instinct of one of the mums just sort of kicked in. And so she was quite frantic. So she ran over to the toilet, sort of thinking perhaps someone had been, waiting in the toilets for them when they got there. But what she actually discovered was that her 9-year-old son was being sexually abused by the other 9-year-old. So, I haven't had it confirmed, but from the information that I was given, I would say it's highly likely that this 9-year-old who was doing the perpetrating was a victim of abuse himself, and he was just reenacting what had been done to him. And unfortunately, that's a really, really common way that victims can actually react when they're being abused. So both stories, were really shocking. But what really struck home is that in both cases, the mums had actually been supervising their children at the time. And I just hadn't ever thought that was possible, that, your children, could be abused while you're there, while you're just a few metres away from them. And I guess I hadn't ever really given much thought to the fact that abuse can actually come from a child's own peers, which again just really, it changes the way that you think about this subject. And the final thing that I think really made me passionate about doing something about this topic was that these events actually occurred in my own immediate community. And so, that really struck a chord with me. And when I got home, I was really upset for these families and what they'd gone through, but it also made me really want to find out what I needed to do to protect my own children. At that stage, I had 3 little ones. I've now got 4, but at the time I just had the 3. And I realised that the only way forward was really to educate them and to empower them so that they could actually protect themselves. So that's sort of how the whole journey began, and it was at that point I then sort of looked at what resources were available, and I couldn't find, exactly what I was looking for, and it went from there.
Fascinating. And, it's something that's been very good and very purposeful that obviously has come from a very sad and scary catalyst, really. But before we dive into how we can equip children in having these protective behaviour conversations, do you have any statistics about how prevalent child abuse actually is?
I do, Claire. And whilst you don't want to dwell on them or become overly anxious about it, I think it is really important that we as parents are actually aware of them and just acknowledge them. And the one statistic that I like to use is that in an average primary school class in Australia, we've normally got about 22 kids. 2 girls and 1 boy will actually report being sexually abused by the time they're 15. Now, that's shocking enough for me, but the reality is that's actually only the tip of the iceberg, because this is only reported cases, and we know so much abuse actually goes unreported, and it's actually only taking into account children up to the age of 15, not 18. So, I think it's really important just to be aware of how prevalent it is. And the other thing to look at is actually a breakdown of those statistics. And shockingly, it's only in 11% of those cases that the child was actually abused by a stranger, which means in 90% of cases, they actually, they know the person that's abusing them. And even more shockingly, in half of those cases again, so that's 45% of cases, the child is actually being abused by a relative. And, I point that out to parents. That includes parents. That includes mums and dads. It includes step-parents. It could be a grandparent. It could be an auntie and uncle, or it could be a cousin or a sibling of the child. They really are shocking statistics. And it's really important that as a parent, you don't bury your head in the sand and think, well, that's not going to happen to my child because, I'm from, a family where those sort of things don't happen. Because the truth is that childhood sexual abuse actually cuts across all demographics of society. So it doesn't matter where you live, whether you've, earn a lot of money, you don't earn a lot of money. It doesn't matter whether you're a stay-at-home mum or whether you're a career mum. It doesn't matter, whether or not your child is, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought then. So it doesn't matter.
It'll come back. It happens to the best of us, Michelle.
Okay. So I was talking about the fact that, it cuts across all demographics of society. So, it doesn't matter where you live, who you are, what cultural background you come from, you are actually, all our children are at risk. So it's just really important that we acknowledge that.
And as you were sharing in that original story as well, being glued to our children 24/7 doesn't necessarily mean that our children aren't going to be in vulnerable situations as well. Because I'm all for children having freedom and having time away from adults. I don't want you listening in to think, okay, well, that means I'm just going to have to be with my child all the time. We can never have babysitters. Absolutely. We can never have them walk to school or the park by themselves. But it is a case of doing what we can to empower our children to respond differently in those moments or in the time that follows as well. And that's where the importance of your book and the importance of us having these really open and honest conversations with our children come in. So I guess that's the next logical thing to talk about. I think it's a topic that lots of parents potentially avoid. I know in lots of families, they don't even use correct terminology for the body parts. Sure. I guess a lot of us are wanting to protect our children of the fact that there are people out there who might be behaving in ways that aren't really safe and lovely for everybody. So firstly, what kind of ages are we talking about having these conversations with children, and what should we include?
Okay, so it's actually the earlier the better. So I normally say from the age of 3, but my 3-year-old was, 2 last year, and we sat down and read the book together, and it really is a case of the earlier the better. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and that's because, unfortunately, abuse does occur from, often the most vulnerable age can be from 3 to 8 years of age. So the fact that, our children are at risk at that age means we need to be talking to them at that age. So as far as, what sort of information we need to cover, there is actually, quite a lot we need to talk to them about, and that's why I do recommend using a resource, whether it's, Only for Me or another book, or, you go to someone like Brave Hearts and look at what, information that they can give you, because there is quite a lot to cover. But as you mentioned, the first thing that you need to do with your child is actually identify their private parts and use the correct anatomical terms for them. So when we talk about our private parts, we talk about their nipples and their genitals and their bottom or anus. So it's really important that they actually know what private parts are, and again that they use the correct anatomical terms, and that's basically so it doesn't get lost in translation. I can tell you what a journey I've actually been on, because I didn't use correct anatomical terms with my 2 older girls, because I actually, I just didn't refer to it as anything really, because that's sort of what had been passed on by my parents, and the fact that they didn't do that. And so, I've come a long way now to recognising how important that is. And in actual fact, my youngest at the time, he had been taught the Lebanese word for his penis. And so, at the time I thought that was quite cute, and it was a much softer way for us to just discuss it. But when I realised that I was actually putting him at risk, I knew straight away, well, I've got to stop doing that, because his preschool teachers won't actually recognise, what he's talking about if we don't teach him the correct anatomical terms.
Yeah, and the reason that's important is because then if something has happened, and if a child is reporting that information to us or a carer or an educator or someone else in their life, we need to know what they're actually telling us. Because if there's any grey that exists, we're perhaps not as likely to take that communication as seriously, and then that's a child who's unlikely to try and communicate what's happened again.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the first thing to realise. And then, we need to obviously teach our kids that private parts are not for sharing, and, that's where the name of the book comes from, Only for Me, and that no one is to look or touch or feel their private parts, and that no one is allowed to ask them to look or feel and touch their private parts. And I had to take this one step further when I wrote the book, because, in this technologically advanced age, one other real problem or tool that predators are actually utilising during the grooming and seduction process is taking photos. So we actually cover the fact that no one is allowed to take photos of their private parts, and this goes one step further. We've already briefly touched on the concept of pornography. We actually need to teach our kids that it's not okay to see any images of private parts on any sort of device or screen. And, that's really important in this day and age, particularly as it's, often used as part of that grooming or seduction process. So, we need to tell them these things, and we also need to let them know that, predators will often, make the child feel like it's a game, and they'll often reward them for complying with, the behaviour. So we need to say to them, and again, we cover this in the book, that it's not okay if it feels like a game, even if it feels like a game, and it's not okay if you're being rewarded for it. It doesn't mean that it's the correct behaviour. And then obviously you need to then look at how your child is going to react. You need to empower them to know what to do. If you've taught them what is inappropriate, now you need to teach them what to do in that situation if someone does these things to them. So obviously, we reiterate that they must say no, and that's, talked about throughout the book, that I must say no. But I think when you're sitting down with your child, it's also really important to give them options as to how to say no. So ideally, depending on what situation they're in and how uncomfortable they feel, but, saying a big no and making a big fuss and screaming or wanting to get out of that situation, is fantastic if they feel the confidence to do that. But I think in that moment, kids can often freeze. And so you want to give them some really practical ways of actually getting themselves out of the situation, particularly if, they're just feeling uncomfortable, they're feeling anxious, they think something's not right. So the ideas that I give my children are to say, you know what, you can say that you're really busting to go to the toilet and you need to go now. And so you give them that opportunity to get out of the room, or perhaps that you can say, oh, I think I can hear mum calling, I've got to go, and just get themselves out of the room. So that's really important that parents actually sort of almost role play that technique with them, so that they actually have the confidence to do it if they're ever faced with that situation. And then we actually have to reiterate with our kids that they need to say no. Like, it doesn't matter who the person is, that they must say no. So it doesn't matter what relationship we have with that person, and it doesn't matter how important they are, what sort of status they have in the community. They have a right to say no to that person. And that, it doesn't matter if that person says it's a secret, whether that person, makes threats and says something bad's going to happen if they tell. When I talk to preschoolers, I say that's just a trick. And even if for some reason that they feel like they are responsible, it's, and again, we reiterate this in the book, it's not their fault. They're not the ones to blame, and they must come and tell, someone that they can trust. And then the final part of that, of course, is actually establishing with your children who they can trust. And the book allows just at the end for you to sit down with your child and record the names of 5 adults who they could go to if they're ever, concerned or worried about something that had happened.
Yeah, that is so constructive. And I think for people who want to have these conversations but have no idea what it needs to encompass, that gives them an amazing place to start. And I guess, upon hearing that response that you gave, it gives you a scope that this isn't a one-off conversation. This is a very in-depth topic. It's going to require the layering of conversation. But ultimately then it gives our child confidence and us confidence as well as parents and caregivers to know that should a situation arise, hopefully it won't ever arise, but if it does, then they're going to handle it to the best of their ability.
That's right. And I think, Claire, it's just important to note that, there is no foolproof way of protecting our kids in any situation. And so, sometimes abuse can still occur to children with fantastic parents. But, just like with any other situation in life, we just, we empower them and we educate them to the best of our ability to keep them safe.
Absolutely. And knowing as well that we have a very, very important role. This is for educators as well, that if a child or, a young adult tells us something along these lines of something that's happened or something that someone's done that sounds a bit iffy to us, we really need to take it seriously, because so many children, the first person they reach out to and feel comfortable with and tell, so often if that person doesn't take it seriously, then that child does just keep it all locked within, and then they're potentially in a situation where that abuse is going to continue as well. So it's really important to be aware of our role after the fact as well, that we really need to sit up and take notice and support our child through that other side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
I think too, what's really important beyond these protective behaviour conversations is actually making sure that we live and breathe it in our own interactions. So, for example, if we're teaching children to say no when touch doesn't feel right, then we also need to know that they might say no for us giving them a kiss sometimes at bedtime, or they might say no to granny who wants to give them a hug. So I think that it's really important alongside these conversations to actually make sure that this is a message that filters through. It's all about child consent, even when it's a situation that doesn't come into this realm of abuse. It further supports the idea that body belongs to them and they get to choose what happens to it.
Absolutely, and it's a really good point, and it's one that I actually did cover in Only for Me, and we talk about I can say no whenever I like if someone's touch doesn't feel right. It might be a kiss or maybe a cuddle or stroking my body when having a snuggle. So it's giving permission to children to say no. And what I suggest to parents, if they suspect that a child is just kind of pushing the boundaries maybe and being a little bit defiant, well, they can certainly still be respectful to perhaps a grandparent that wanted a kiss and cuddle by, doing a high five or perhaps a handshake instead, and by taking the intimacy out of it, just to, as you say, give them the control over, their own body.
Yeah, I like those suggestions because it can be a little bit socially awkward sometimes when we are being our child's advocate, and encouraging them to be their own advocate as well.
Absolutely.
So if we are in that really unfortunate position where we suspect that our child is being abused, what do we actually do, Michelle?
Okay, so if we're actually concerned about the current sexual harm of your child, of course, you need to call the police immediately. However, if your child has disclosed something to you, or if you are actually, suspicious that abuse might have occurred or be occurring, I recommend that you actually ring the Brave Hearts support line, which it's on my website, but it's 1-800-272-831, and they will provide you with the support and advice about how best to proceed, taking into account, the well-being of your child. And the reason that I often point people in that direction is because when we're looking nationally, every state and territory actually have their own department that will look after you. So, and again, I do have the links on my website to the government page, which will put you in touch with the specific department depending on where you live in Australia. And then they will obviously advise you and support you through the process of what happens next.
Brilliant. It's nice to know that support's out there, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well to make it easy for people.
Great.
Now, thinking about school curriculum, I know that lots of us listening in will be thinking, okay, that sounds great, but my child's already at school and protective behaviours is part of the curriculum that happens in that classroom environment. So for people that are in that position, that have got children 5 and up, do we still need to be having these conversations, or do you feel that the school is doing enough?
Well, personally, I have to say that I think it's really important that we as parents continue to have these conversations with our children for a couple of reasons. Primarily because we are the primary educators of our children, and it is ultimately our responsibility. I think also you then as a parent are in control as to, sort of the information and really confirming with your child that they understand the concepts and they understand exactly, what they need to do in a particular situation. I think that, we want to really nurture a relationship with our child where they feel comfortable coming to us. So, if we don't have that conversation with our children and we leave it to teachers and other educators, then, they're not necessarily going to feel that we're available to them, and they might feel a bit awkward or embarrassed having that conversation with us. Whereas when we talk about it, on a relatively frequent basis with our kids, it's going to feel like a natural and normal part of our of your relationship with your child, and they'll be happy, to come to you with any questions or concerns they have. And I don't know about you, but ultimately, I want to be the first port of call for my child if they're ever concerned or worried about something.
Absolutely. And I don't think that outsourcing is a good way to go, but I just know that for a lot of people, they would probably assume that at that classroom level, it's the same as the conversations at home. And there are definitely overlaps, but I know from having taught protective behaviours in the classroom, I think it's a much more conservative approach. And even as far as naming the body parts, it's accurate, but they don't go into as much detail. And also, I guess it's in that large group environment. So it might actually bring up some questions, or it might bring up other things for children, but they're not necessarily feeling in that 1 to 20 something ratio that they can actually go further and have those questions answered.
That's right. That's right. And I think, that applies for any of us in that group situation. So, you're sitting down with one or two children, then obviously, it's really going to foster that opportunity for them to clarify anything that they're not sure about.
Yeah. Speaking of the school curriculum, do you feel that your book would be helpful for teachers as part of their protective behaviours curriculum?
Well, I certainly hope so. So the book was actually released 18 months ago, and in that time, I've actually sold about 3,500 copies. And whilst the majority of those would be mums and dads, I've actually had, a lot of orders come through from schools and educators. I had one school that actually bought a copy for every single classroom from K through to year 6, which I think is a real testament to the fact that they're finding it useful. And also last year I had an order from Sydney Catholic schools, and they purchased 170 copies. So they purchased a copy for each school within the Sydney region. So I'm hoping that speaks for itself, and that, indicates that, it's obviously being helpful in that classroom setting as well.
Yeah, it does absolutely speak volumes. And I think that you've done such a great job with the book, because obviously, what we're talking about in this episode, it's a very heavy topic. And so it can feel quite heavy in talking to children about it too. But I think that with the illustrations, with the rhyming words, it really sends a powerful message, but still in a childlike way. It's still a very appropriate book to share with children. I don't feel like it's stripping them of their innocence or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, that was a part of the mission when I wrote the book, was that that was really important to me as a mother, that I wanted to protect my children's innocence. And so absolutely, I hope that I have achieved that, and I believe that I have, so that, you can have those conversations, but, at the same time, you're protecting them as much as possible. And, it's all about, using age-appropriate language. As I said before, you don't talk about pornography, but you just talk about the fact that no one's allowed to show them images on any sort of, device. So, it's just keeping it all age appropriate. And as you say, the rhyming and the illustrations, I was very, very lucky to have a former Disney animator available to me, who was another mum at my children's school. So I got the best of the best. And yeah, I think she's done a fantastic job in helping to facilitate that warmth and gentleness.
So before we say goodbye, Michelle, where can people find the book?
Okay, so it's available, Clare, on my website, which is www.onlyforme.com.au, and it's available for $15.95, and that includes delivery Australia-wide, and of course I will also ship to international locations if need be. And I just want to mention at this point that it's actually endorsed by Act for Kids, which is one of Australia's leading child protection agencies. It's also a resource of the Sydney Children's Hospital. And finally, I've actually decided to donate 100% of my author royalties to Bravehearts and Act for Kids to help them continue the amazing work that they do, treating victims and preventing abuse.
Wow, that's so heartwarming, Michelle. I loved hearing that. Yeah, well done for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. And also I will say that on the website, for people that want to get a bit more of a look at the book before purchasing, you've actually got a preview on there as well. So you get a sense of exactly what the book is like. And I think that will help you in your buying decision too.
Fantastic. That's great. Thanks, Claire.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Michelle. And until next time, be kind to yourself.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit thrivingchildren.com.au.